right. As we see people coming in, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Timothy Plett. I am a member of the Renegade Institute for Liberty, and I'm happy to host this webinar with Dr. John Cooper. We'll do more of an introduction once the time for this seminar gets started, but for now, we'll let folks get in as they can. Still a little bit early. I have 5:58 on my watch, so we'll give folks a little bit of time to get in and get settled before we get started. I hope everyone is having a good evening so far this evening. Middle of the semester, never quite sure where folks are at. As for myself, I recently gave and graded a unit exam, so still recovering a little bit from that, but doing okay. Glad to see more folks are coming in. Thank you all for joining us this evening. And we will be looking forward to receiving audience questions once Dr. Cooper has made his presentation. Professor Harvath and myself will take first crack at him, but then we will definitely open it up to questions from anyone who wants to pose anything to him. And do make use of the Q&A function in Zoom to do that. We greatly appreciate your input. And it looks like our other faculty member is online now. Hello, Dr. Harvath. Good to see you.
Hello, Dr. Harvath.
As always, you have to remember to unmute. Hello, everybody.
Greetings. Yeah, unmute. It's amazing how fast all of the Zoom stuff and the Zoom etiquette that you learned over COVID just disappears on you.
As fast as an Econ 1 student forgets what we teach them in economics, yeah.
Oh dear. All right, we see more people trickling in. That's good. I'm glad to see that. Give them a few more minutes before we go ahead and get started. All right, got a question from the chat. Will this be recorded? It is recording in progress. So yes, this will be recorded, and Renegade Institute for Liberty will be uploading this for anyone who wishes to view it at a later time. We have started the official Zoom meeting, though we haven't started the presentation yet. We're still giving a few more minutes for any latecomers. I'm glad to see that we have quite a few people already in. We'll get started in 1 more minute. Current plan to upload the video will be to YouTube. And so that'll be the primary platform on which we upload it. And if you are interested in the link to that video later on, I will make sure to provide it. All righty. Well, it is. Oh, what's up? Okay, we have a bit of a technical issue here. That is a good thing we should check first. Can other attendees hear and see what's happening in the Zoom session? All right, glad to see that mostly it's going well. I'm sorry, Gris, if there's something as an issue. One thing you can try is to log out and then try to log back in. Sometimes that fixes the audio stuff. Question to Jason. We're looking at probably an hour and a half. Though things go longer, we'll see. But for now, I think it is appropriate that we go ahead and get started. So before we get started, allow me to give a brief introduction for our distinguished guest, Dr. John Cooper. Dr. Cooper, as far as his resume goes, a lot of his work that he'll be talking about today will focus around some of the work that he did as a research assistant at AEI, where he worked with US Ambassador Michael Novak, who was a great champion of democratic capitalism, as well as his work as a president of a think tank. But in addition to these things, he also served as an associate professor and dean of academic affairs at Bridgewater College in Virginia. And he also served as headmaster to 3 different private or charter schools. At the moment, he is currently a consultant with the Education Group. And without further ado, we thank you, Dr. Cooper, for coming in and talking to us about the upcoming topic, and you are free to take it away.
Well, thank you, Dr. Plett. It's great to be with everybody this evening. It's been a few years since I was with the Renegade Institute, and some of you anyway, in a discussion, I think, which happened in the home of Damon and Merlene Johnson. So lots of fun to be involved with you again, and we follow your activities as a group from afar. Hello from Texas. I'm zooming in from the great city of Fort Worth. And I thought I would share with you a Texas joke. I think it's really appropriate since we are coming to you from Texas. Did you hear about the cowboy who said to his friend, "Would you help me round up 18 cows?" His friend said, "Sure, that's easy. It's 20. And I can hear the laughter, even though your mics are muted. Well, it's great to be with you this evening. And again, as Dr. Plett said, I'm going to be making a presentation. Then we're going to have some respondents and then take your questions and answers. So certainly can be rather informal after we sort of lay down some principles or concepts to discuss a little bit later. And I hope we'll have a rigorous discussion. So let me, if I can do this, share the screen and see if everybody can see that. And allow me to adjust it on my end a little bit. All right. Dr. Platt, I'm assuming that you will know and you'll hear from people if there is any problem technically with seeing what's going on the screen. So our topic today is the case for democratic capitalism over democratic socialism. And this is a topic that's been argued about ad nauseum, you might say. And my training is as a philosopher, not as an economist. And yet I want to do something a little bit different tonight, and that is take what I hope will be an empirical approach to this question rather than a philosophical one. I think we'll move back and forth between empirical and philosophical concepts. So appreciate your kind introduction, Dr. Platt. I'll give our participants a bit more of a biography here on the screen, which might be helpful. And I'll leave it up for a few minutes while I mention some of the ground rules, I think, for this evening. So first of all, I want to give a preference for empirical conclusions over philosophical theories, as I said. Secondly, I want to make a commitment to you right now that this is going to be a nonpartisan discussion over public policy. Having worked in 3 different think tanks in Washington, D.C. and Tallahassee, Florida, I gained a keen awareness of the difference between talking about public policy and talking about partisan issues. And there's a place for both of those in our world. But particularly, I think, for scholars, we need to hone our skills to keep our discussion at the level of public policy and to stay away from nonpartisan debates, at least in our academic activities. And third, I want to promise you that whatever is said, however we agree or disagree on things, we will certainly end the evening as friends and really as fellow seekers for the answers. So those are the ground rules. Let me jump into just a little bit here. How did I miss slide 3? Let me go back a minute. We can't do that. All right. Dr. Plitt, can you give me a thumbs up if you're seeing a screen that says outline?
I'm currently seeing a screen that has a absolutely fantastic geological formation on it. I'm not seeing your presentation, unfortunately.
Okay, let me try this again. I've somehow probably messed it up on my part.
We're not in a rush, so.
All right, how about now?
Okay, I am seeing it now. Thank you.
Okay, and is it taking up the whole screen?
Not yet. We're just seeing it as sort of in the edit mode.
Okay, how about now?
Now we're doing good.
All right.
Well, and actually now we're seeing the presenter mode.
Oh, okay. Well, let me get back out of that then. And we'll just turn off. Okay, are we fairly close to full screen there?
We are pretty close. You can also, yeah.
How
Yeah,
about
we're
that?
very close to full screen. That I
Okay.
think will do.
Good, good.
And I think advancing should be as simple as hitting the page up or page down buttons.
Yeah, and that's what I'm trying to do here. And I'm not advancing yet. So let me go back.
Attendees, thank you for your patience as we deal with technical difficulties. It was working just fine in the practice session. Of course,
Of course.
when we get to the regular session, it starts to go nuts. And someone typed in the Q&A, it looks like Murphy's Law is in effect. Accurate.
That is true.
I hate to point out that this Zoom being a private company, this is going against your thesis.
All right. How about now? Can we see it?
All right, we can see it again.
All right. I'm still
It's
having,
in the, yeah.
okay. I'm still having trouble
Okay.
advancing. That's my
Okay.
only hang up right now is figuring out how to advance. Wait a minute. There we go.
Okay, that'll also work. All righty then. We are back in business.
All right, we're back in business. Here we go. Here's what I want to talk about this evening, and here's an outline that we can kind of follow. First, I want to start with definitions of capitalism, socialism, start with some standard definitions, but talk a little bit about what I see as some deficiencies. And then look at this central section of the presentation, which is empirical approaches. We're going to look at a couple of indices of political freedom and economic freedom, and we're going to take a little bit of a side trip into the empirical record of history. Having looked at that, asking ourselves what conclusions we might draw from empirical information, I want to come back to the question of definitions and see if we can hone the definitions of democratic capitalism and democratic socialism a little better. And then finish up with a short section on mapping political ideologies. We always hear about terms like the left and the right, or capitalist and socialist, or authoritarian and democratic, etc. So we want to talk a little bit about terminology and mapping political ideologies. So let's jump right in. Some standard definitions of capitalism and socialism. And these I just have pulled from Encyclopedia Britannica. Interestingly enough, I think you will find that they're somewhat helpful on the one hand, maybe on another hand, not so helpful. Capitalism. Most of the means of production are privately owned, so private ownership seems to be a factor. Production and income are shaped by the operation of markets. So how do markets operate? And market competition drives greater efficiencies. That's what we learned from Britannica. At the opposite end of the spectrum, we learned that socialism calls for public rather than private ownership, and that this is intended as a method to live in cooperation with one another in a society which collectively owns the property and makes the economic decisions for the benefit of all members. So let me hold on just a second so I can pull up another screen here on my side. Have I messed up your vision at all?
Nope,
Looks
I'm
like-
still seeing the slide that we were just on with capitalism, mixed economy, and socialism.
Good. All right, let's see if I can pull up my notes on this other screen then. All right, thank you so much for your patience. I think we're almost here to where I'm trying to get to so I can see my presentation notes as well. Okay, so again, as I said, initially we might find these definitions helpful. Particularly, maybe we're fascinated with this notion of mixed economy, that in fact a lot of countries have some capitalist and socialist policies that are mixed together. And in fact, we might really think about the fact that that's fairly common. However, at the end, I think we're left wondering a little bit about whether this definition or these definitions raise more questions than they provide answers. So what are some of those questions we might be asking ourselves? First of all, about capitalism. If it's private ownership and markets, which we might also assume has something to do with the price mechanism, and market competition, and these things drive greater efficiencies, we might ask ourselves, is this true? If so, how does that function? Do efficiencies result in increased economic growth and prosperity, and therefore higher living standards and greater human flourishing? And are there real world examples of this? So those are some of the questions we might raise about this definition of capitalism. Secondly, at the bottom of the screen, if you will, or in the socialism category, state ownership and control of property and natural resources results in people living in cooperation and allocating resources for the benefit of all people. So we'd want to ask ourselves that again, is this true? And if so, how does that function? Does cooperation result in increased economic growth and prosperity, higher living standards, greater human flourishing, or one might simply say greater human happiness? And are there real world examples of this? Just to pause for a second on the definition of mixed economies, we might ask ourselves, okay, if in actual practice, lots of countries mix the capitalist and the socialist models, can free markets coexist with government intervention? Can there be a stable equilibrium of these things, or aren't capitalism and socialism as principles, organizing principles for economies, antithetical? And so while there might be something in actual practice called mixed economy, we might ask, is it on its way to one or the other ends of the spectrum, so to speak? So let's see what insight we might be able to glean from empirical data. I've chosen a couple of rankings, one of economic freedom and one of political freedom, or we might simply say of economic procedure and political procedure. The Economic Freedom of the World is an annual survey published by the Canadian think tank, the Fraser Institute. It has something of a conservative reputation. Freedom in the World is an annual global report on political rights and civil liberties published by the Freedom House. And they've done this for decades and decades. In fact, both of these ratings have been around for a long, long time. And one of the things I want you to see here, both of these ratings try to cover the entire world, approximately 160 countries. For our purposes, I've focused on the larger countries and the larger economies, so I won't show you all 160. But I do think, I think we want to focus in on the fact that how is economic freedom or economic procedure defined? How is freedom defined? Or how is political liberty, however we might use those terms, how is it defined? So the Fraser Institute ranking looks at size of government. You can see there some of the factors. Security of property rights, access to sound money. I think most of us have maybe didn't think as much about inflation a few years ago as we do now, but that's where a topic like inflation falls. Freedom to trade internationally, and regulation. So what'll be interesting to look at these rankings is to say, well, some countries might do better, that is, have more economic freedom in one area rather than another. And however much they approximate sort of the Fraser Institute ideal, they will get an overall score. And it'll be the combination of these 5 factors. Same thing happens with the Freedom in the World rating for political rights and civil liberties. They break it down into those 2 categories, but you can see that it involves a great deal more than that, or more specific than that, such as electoral processes, political pluralism, whether it, in fact, when democratic elections are held, whether the levers of power actually change hands, that sort of thing. Civil liberties would, everything that would fall under our normal thinking about individual rights and liberties, things like the Bill of Rights. So we have these 2 rankings, and we want to ask a couple of questions about them in our own mind. What do they tell us about the real world empirically? What do they tell us about capitalism and socialism? And how are the 2 related? So let me show you this chart. It is described, or it is designed, if you will, it is designed to show most of the major countries in the world based on these 2 lists. The economic freedom rank in the upper left-hand corner is from the Fraser Institute. A couple of columns over, the political freedom score is the ranking or score from Freedom House. So the countries that you see here are in the order of ranking by the Fraser Institute for economic freedom. We've taken the same countries and shown their political freedom score, highest being 100, lowest being 0. And this allows us to compare, in effect, the highest score countries on an economic scale as well as on a political scale, or to see how those scores compare. The Freedom House folks have also added a handy descriptor, which really just breaks down into free, partly free, and not free. So the chart then shows that there seems to be, first of all, I think the first thing we would notice about this is a fairly high correlation between economic freedom and political freedom. You might, in fact, see some things that are surprising to you. You might think to yourself, well, gosh, I'm surprised that this one country is ranked higher than this other country. That's reasonable. You might also want to ask a couple of other questions. First of all, this data is a few years old. And when I first prepared this presentation a few years ago, put a lot of work into this particular chart. Rather than recreate it, I first took a look to see whether these rankings have changed much in the last 3 years. And in fact, they have not. I took the top 10 in both categories of economic and political freedom, in fact, dipping into the teens and everything else. And I could not find any particular large difference that's shown over the last few years, with the exception of Hong Kong and the United States slipped a few rankings. Most of those in the top 10 never moved more than 1 position, either up or down. So again, the first, I think, and most obvious observation we want to make about this data is that political freedom and economic freedom are strongly correlated. Now, if you read the entire report from the Fraser Institute, you'll also know that economic freedom is strongly correlated with economic growth in general. So a lot of measures of economic growth can be used. The Fraser Institute talks about GDP, gross domestic product, but as well as looking at production, you can look at median income, and you can look at calorie intake and those sorts of things. So there are lots of ways to determine the success of the system. But at the end of the day, that correlation between political freedom and economic freedom is strong. And the correlation between economic growth in general and economic freedom is strong. So I'm going to come back to this chart in a minute, but let me give you a little bit more observation. Again, as I said, the data is about 3 years old, but it has held up pretty steadily with what it was before, a few years ago. North Korea and Cuba were not listed in the Fraser Index, but there is another similar index from the Heritage Wall Street Journal, and they are listed. So we've included those two countries here accordingly. But the four main conclusions I want to have us consider from these rankings are that political freedom and economic freedom are strongly correlated, as I said. Secondly, that economic freedom is strongly correlated with economic growth. The third thing the full report shows is that economic freedom is strongly correlated with higher average income per person, higher income of the poorest 10%, higher life expectancy, higher literacy, lower infant mortality, higher access to water resources, and less corruption. In other words, a whole range of measures of, you might say, human flourishing. Finally, it might be interesting to note for you that the full report also shows that economic freedom has an almost negligible, though slightly positive, correlation with income equality. So the notion, if you think about this as a sort of a major aspirational goal of socialism, is to equalize income. Or sometimes we hear this discussed as equity or equality of result rather than equality of opportunity. We might be interested to know that how a country is placed on this scale between high economic freedom and low economic freedom is not necessarily correlated with income equality. Here, going back to the chart. So, in other words, there may be, some people have speculated, there may be times in the development of a country from poorer to richer where income inequality is greater, and that drives the move towards industrialization, for example. Or there may be other factors in play. We just don't know that. But I mean, one of the really interesting things about looking at the data is to realize that countries don't necessarily have a process or a performance that matches their stated ideological goals. And spending a lot of time with this chart, I think you probably will find more and more of that kind of thought coming up in your mind. I know many of you are probably familiar with some of these countries and wondering, okay, why is it there? Maybe you're a little bit surprised. Maybe you're not a little bit surprised that it's ranked where it is. By the way, I noticed that I spelled the word Chile wrong. It should have an E on the end. There's probably a few other typos in this whole thing. But I thought the first and most important thing for us to look at, and when asking about the empirical performance of countries, is to look at the relationship between economic freedom and political freedom. Now let's turn our attention from the empirical evidence of these rankings, and we can certainly go back to them and try to answer more questions about them. But let's look at another area where we don't necessarily always think of it as empirical, but let's look at the record of history for a second. The notion of political freedom is a long-standing topic. It puts us in mind of thinking about the history of the way that political order has evolved down through the centuries. We know, for example, that early tribal civilizations and early cities were largely autocratic or authoritarian. If you have a single source, a single king, a single monarch who is the decision maker, yes, that person might either be a benign monarch or a non-benign monarch, we might say a tyrant, but the system is a system of autocracy. Some of the earliest lawgivers, like a Hammurabi or a Moses, were in fact known in their own time, we might say, as well as down through history, as having developed and delivered to the people a logical system of law. And in fact, what happened is these logical systems of law began to command more respect than any one person. So as the king passed his crown along to his son and the son to the grandson, you may have people who were more or less living up to the standard of the law which had been propagated. So right away, the law itself becomes its own entity. It becomes almost a kind of check and balance against the decision-making, arbitrary decision-making of the autocrat. This same introduction of checks and balances, if you will, then continues on through history. Notice from this third bullet, kings are subject to internal competitors who try to put limits on their autocracy. We see a lot of this happening in history. Those internal competitors might be religious leaders, landowners, merchants, intellectuals, but they are the first sort of checks and balances, if you will, on the authority of the monarch. And so in some societies, not all, autocratic systems evolved into something we might call constitutional monarchy. The Magna Carta is a good example of that. And then over time, the constitutional monarchy evolves into something that we generally know as the constitutional republic. Something that enshrines the consent of the governed, the right of the people to choose their political leaders. That generally happens through an elected executive and elected representatives, and a judiciary which has some accountability to that democratic process. But when that constitutional republic emerges, we also see that the powers of government are limited. And there are broad areas of society which are outside of that direct control of the government. These would include economics, artistic expression, religion, journalism, etc. We're particularly interested in economics here because we're interested in systems that place economics in a category that is determined by the free decisions of individuals and voluntary groups, and kept outside of direct political control, although they might be regulated. So with that sort of brief little tour through the empirical journey of history, we're left thinking back about our chart. Ironically, most of the countries in the world today claim to be democracies. Even communist countries, which are often actually autocracies, if not always, claim to be democracies. Like the earliest autocracies, the unlimited power of one political party, in this case, we might be talking about communist countries, but we could also be talking about, say, Sharia law in some Islamic countries. That unlimited power of one particular political party can be relatively benign or tyrannical, just like the first autocrats in the world. But what they can't be is actually respecting the consent of the governed. So we get a clear distinction, if you will, between autocracy and a constitutional republic, or what we might just use a kind of shorthand for the constitutional republic and just say democracy. The choice between, if you will, autocracy and democracy, as you look at the development down through history, seems to be emerging as more of a binary choice than a question of mixing the models of autocracy and constitutional republic, or autocracy and democracy. So I just want to leave that with you for just a second, because this question about whether when we're looking at a spectrum of choices, whether it's a binary choice or whether blending or mixing is a possibility, is one that I think is important to discuss. Now, here I'm going to go out on a limb and just give you my thoughts. My pragmatic conclusion from examining this empirical record, namely the rankings of political and economic freedom and the historical journey of world history from autocracy to constitutional republicanism. I think it's a journey, by the way. I don't think it was inevitable, and I don't think it necessarily signals improvement until you make that decision yourself about what form of government you prefer. But there is this journey, if you will, from autocracy to democracy. Looking at those two empirical factors, my pragmatic conclusion would be to focus on those countries that enjoy greater political and economic freedom and, as I said before, increased economic growth and prosperity and higher living standards, greater human flourishing. And those are the countries in our list that are found largely in North America and Europe, and several countries around the Pacific Rim. So again, if I just jump back in our slides here, a few. Hong Kong may be a special case right now, but as we read down, Singapore, New Zealand, Switzerland, Australia, USA, Canada, Ireland, Denmark, and then, add all the way yourself down through the 20th rank, Japan. These are the kinds of countries that we're looking at, which exhibit relatively higher economic freedom, relatively higher political freedom. They have been the kinds of countries that have emerged as democracies in the true sense of the word, rather than sort of in the aspirational sense, if you will, or constitutional republics. And if we look at those countries, in other words, put some focus on those, we might then be able to advance our conversation a little bit more. So I'm going to focus on those countries now and give you some thoughts on what is the difference then between democratic capitalism and democratic socialism. I would say that democratic capitalism, and to some extent, my mentor, Mike Novak, sort of coined the phrase, if you will. It refers to that form of political economy. It's relatively common in the United States and in several other Pacific Rim countries that starts with a market economy and then combines with it limited social welfare programs, a policy of moderate taxation, a moderately regulated economy, in effect, a kind of capitalism, though one that we could debate whether there's any such thing as pure capitalism. Secondly, democratic socialism, sometimes called social democracy, particularly in the European context, I would define as that form of political economy. It's relatively common in Europe and Canada, which starts with a market economy, but then combines with it a much more extensive social welfare program, relatively higher taxation than the democratic capitalist countries, and a heavily regulated economy. But at the end of the day, this is still a type of capitalism. Sometimes it's even referred to as socialism within capitalism. And by contrast, what I would call actual socialism, first of all, it's not found in the focus countries that we've identified, but actual socialism replaces a market economy with a state-run economy. And these are either monopolies or monopsonies, the control of the production or the control of the consumption of goods. They tend to destroy the democratic consent of the governed, and they tend to create welfare states, just as the others do, what we might call cradle-to-grave welfare states, very extensive welfare states, which provide the same living standards. Ultimately, they provide the same living standards for everyone, but those living standards tend to be substandard and really subsistence level. Not anything like what we would recognize as the social welfare programs that are present in those countries that might be called democratic capitalist or democratic socialist. So what might we conclude from beginning with these kinds of definitions of democratic capitalism and socialism? First of all, they're both types of capitalism. They both start with the market economy, sort of as a baseline. And then they have rigorous debates on how much taxation, how much money is going to be redistributed through taxation into social welfare programs. How much will the economy be regulated through tariffs, through subsidies, etc., in order to achieve social goods, certain goals, and will that amount of regulation and taxation and a welfare state, size of the welfare state, will it be in effect enough to deplete the efficiency gains that we've already noted are part of a market economy? So that, in many ways, is a better description of the kinds of debates that we see in the news all the time, and we see particularly during a presidential election year. Debates over the definition of what is the best regulated market economy that one could have. And these are debates that largely happen, again, in Europe, North America, around some of the Pacific Rim countries. And they are frequently the issues on which elections turn. And so a government of the center right might be replaced by a government of the center left, and vice versa. And we see this pattern happening over and over again. One of the things I think would be very fascinating to have more discussion about is whether this group of focus countries might learn from one another some valuable lessons. That is, not necessarily repeat the same mistakes that other countries make on their journey towards finding the ideal mix of a regulated market economy. Another way of putting that, you might think of this as putting yourself in the shoes of the United States citizen. Is our economy, as it gets more regulated, let's say, becoming more like Europe? And if so, did countries in Europe who've tried some of these same policies, did they find that those policies were successful? And if you were in a European context, you might be asking the same question. Are the ways in which, say, the United States or Korea or Taiwan implements their market economy, their regulated market economy, can lessons be learned from that? So, nearing the end here, I'll offer these two preliminary definitions of democratic capitalism and democratic socialism. And I want to sort of argue in this definition, if you will, that a minimalist type of a regulated market economy is preferable to a maximalist type of regulated market economy. And by that, under democratic socialism, again, as I said, I do not mean Marxian socialism. So private ownership, free markets, a limited welfare state, and a government that enforces the laws that prevent theft and fraud. And that, by the way, includes externalities such as pollution. This final bullet, I include in both of the definitions of democratic capitalism and democratic socialism. The differences happen in the details. The devil is in the details. If democratic socialism buys into some degree of public ownership, think, for example, national health systems, and these are agreed to by democratic consent, which they typically are, it may risk creating inefficiencies and lowering productivity and reducing wealth. That may be something that voters are willing to accept, but it will be a reality in the economic sense that greater inefficiencies and, let's say, less economic growth, less wealth production, etc. Same thing happens as you increase the amount of government intervention in markets with things like subsidies and tariffs and tax policies. And the same thing happens with expanding the welfare state, again, by democratic consent, etc. By the way, if you go back to our chart and look at some of those countries that are known as democratic socialist countries, or their policies can be accurately described as that, some will have a greater degree of public ownership, but less intervention in markets. And some others might have more intervention in markets and less in public ownership. All of those decisions at the micro level will make a difference as to where they rank in those overall rankings, how economically free they are. And remember, since economic freedom is correlated with economic growth, some countries might actually achieve some significant growth, even when it doesn't look like they would be able to. One example of which is Sweden, for example. Because Volvo is such a big part of the Swedish economy, they are very reluctant to intervene in international markets and play the tariff game, because their economy depends an awful lot on being able to sell a lot more Volvos than Swedes can buy. So on the other hand, they might have a very expansive welfare state, and they do, and it might be very expensive, but if their behavior in the area of tariffs is strong enough to outweigh the negative effects, if you will, of an expansive welfare state, they might still find themselves in a position of growth, and in a position in which they may rank in the rankings, they might rank higher than another country. This can be part of the reason why we're surprised sometimes that country X is ranked a little bit higher than country Y. I hope that's clear. If you spend a little time with the data and go over the Fraser Institute report, I think you'll find that some of those nuances that I'm describing about different ways that democratic socialism or democratic capitalism can be implemented, some of those will show up in the rankings. So let me start to bring this to a conclusion, but then I'm going to add one more little sidebar at the end. One of the things that Michael Novak was very good at describing in his many works, including The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, probably the most important of those works, was in describing the three-part nature of society. And he said, essentially, you have to understand that there's an interaction between these three things, but they also should be looked at separately. There's a political order, there's an economic order, and there's a cultural order. And when you ask about human flourishing, you're asking which model of society best approximates human freedom, moral responsibility, human rights, and equality. And the question can be divided into these three categories: politics, economics, and culture. The big $64,000 question is, are there binary choices between, let's take the area of politics, binary choices between centralized power and democracy? Or is it possible to have a kind of stable 50-50 mix in this area of politics? Likewise, we might ask the same question about the economic order. Is it possible to have government control and production and consumption, that is pure socialism, if you will, and have regulated market economy, whether you call it the minimalist type or the maximalist type? Are these two things a binary choice, or can we have a kind of 50-50 mixed economy that is, equally capitalist and equally socialist? And thirdly, in the area of culture, we haven't talked very much about this, but it's an important aspect of society that runs side by side with these other two. If the choice is between ideological uniformity, and oftentimes within the culture, there are a lot of tools or mechanisms or weapons to use to enforce ideological uniformity? Or is the society going to reflect a real pluralism of ideas where there is a marketplace of ideas, really differing ideas, ideas that might disagree with one another, and yet a debate which is civil and tolerant? So again, in this third area, I think the question is this a binary choice, or can we kind of have our cake and eat it too, and have some degree of ideological uniformity and some degree of pluralism of ideas? I think you can tell from my presentation that I'm skeptical that any of these things can be a kind of 50-50 proposition. I think if we view the nature of society this way, and we view our choices as citizens in the political and economic and cultural arena, I think we will be driven by this information, this data, this empirical data, will be driven to make a binary choice between these two. Now, my thesis then would be that the social justice debate, is really presenting us with a binary choice between authoritarianism and democracy, the political sphere, between socialism and capitalism, the economic sphere, and we might say between socialism and market economy, and a choice between ideological uniformity and pluralism of ideas. Real quickly before I wrap up my piece and we'll go to Q&A, let's turn to a much more controversial and much less empirical exercise, and that is something that political scientists have done a lot of, and that is try to map political ideologies. The first kind of mapping happened when the terms left and right came into being during the French Revolution in 1789. The new National Assembly was debating the question, should the king have the right to an absolute veto on legislation? Those who voted yes, favoring tradition, if you will, sat on the right side of the hall. And those who voted no, favoring a more transformational policy with regard to the veto of legislation, sat on the left. And this is how we got this left, right, and center terminology in politics. It looked like, as from about 1850 on, when socialism and capitalism were engaged in a kind of a debate, it looked like the left would line up with socialism and the right with capitalism. But a lot of problems, if you will, seem to be at play in this left-right terminology. First of all, it's one-dimensional. The definitions of left and right are perhaps too broad. Can we have a leftist version of capitalism? Can we have a rightist version of socialism? Is there not a distinction between authoritarian and democracy in this question of left and right? Because isn't it possible that the far left and the far right can both be authoritarian? Example of that might be something like Stalin and Hitler. Why are they different? Why, in what ways are they the same? So political scientists were left with the idea of saying, well, maybe rather than a one-dimensional approach to political terminology, left and right, we could develop a kind of four-quadrant, two-dimensional map. And various ones have been created. I did not necessarily love the ones that I've seen, so I created my own, and I'm going to share that with you. I want to suggest that we can map political terminology in four quadrants that you see here, and that the two quadrants that are above the center line represent various forms of democracy, and that the two quadrants below the center line represent various forms of authoritarianism. You can see from the outer ring of this circle, if you will, that the left and right have been bent around such that the extreme left and the extreme right are now touching at the bottom. The outer circle contains terms that are sometimes associated with politics, the middle circle, terms that are sometimes associated with economics, and perhaps most importantly, I want you to think about these two axes. Because most of us answer questions of a political nature in different ways. We might fall at any particular point in a quadrant system like this. Why do we do that? We might fall a little bit more towards the right-hand side of the page if we're taking a more traditional approach to a problem. So whatever that problem might be, it might be a taxation problem, it might be a question of abortion, et cetera, et cetera. Or if we're, on the other hand, taking a more transformational attitude towards a particular controversial topic, we want to see things not be the way they were traditionally, but we want to see them changed. When people got very excited about outlawing slavery, for example, they were not so interested in traditional and very interested in transformational solutions. A similar thing might be happening with our vertical axis, and that is to say, the closer one is to having a utopian vision of the way things ought to be, perhaps the more likely one is to utilize authoritarian tools to achieve that utopian vision. On the other hand, we know democracy is kind of a messy process. There's a lot of compromise. There's a lot of give and take. There's a lot of pragmatism in democracies. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about this. What are the impulses, if you will, that might draw people in one direction or another? And I wanted to define these four compass points, if you will, in terms that would be neutral. Terms that any one of us might at some time or another say, yeah, I kind of favor a more utopian vision over a pragmatic one, or a more traditional over a transformational, or vice versa, etc. There are a number of other interesting topics that I've listed at the bottom, too much for us to cover in a session like this. However, I challenge you to give some thought to this notion of mapping political terminology and see if it's not of some use to you as you listen to the conversations that happen, both in the political realm and in the economic realm, and to some extent, perhaps even in that cultural realm which we've described. So I leave this with you. This is going to be on YouTube, I guess, so you can access it for more thought on your part. But I want to end my formal presentation at this particular point. And again, I can go back to any of these slides that you would like, but I'm happy to then turn it over to Dr. Plett and to the other respondents, and eventually to your Q&A. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Cooper. And as far as our response is concerned, it'll mostly be in the form of directed questions about your presentation, unless Dr. Harvath has a particular argument he would like to make for the opposing viewpoints.
Not an argument about presenting an opposing viewpoint, but the presentation was at a nice high level of generality. Dr. Cooper, do you have in your mind, do you have what is the representative democratic socialist country that you're thinking of when you say this, and the representative democratic capitalist country? That we could be a bit more specific about exactly what countries we're talking about?
You know, Dr. Harvath, I've thought a lot about that question. In fact, I've been involved in a lot of debates over the years, having people, say, what's your model? I once asked a liberation theologian, for example, we were debating what the future of El Salvador should look like. And I said to him, well, what exactly do you have in mind? Would you like to see El Salvador become like one of the Scandinavian countries? Or would you like to see it become more like the Soviet Union or Cuba? And he had an interesting answer. He said, I don't care what happens as long as the people who are on the bottom end up on the top and the people who are on the top end up on the bottom. And I thought that was a very cynical answer, and one that seemed to suggest that he was not serious about actually thinking which public policies would lead to greater human flourishing. He was really playing a kind of radical's game, if you will, thinking that, gee, if El Salvador could have a revolution and people who've been oppressed could be in charge, then everything in the world would be fine. It's simply not the case. So I tell that story just as a roundabout way to say, from my point of view, if there are people in our listening audience tonight who roughly agree with me that the regulated market economy is somewhere close to our target for aiming at a good society, then I think we can all be relatively friendly towards one another if we take a more democratic capitalist or a more democratic socialist approach to the overall issue or to the individual issues that are out there. That said, I think I've suggested to you that I think the argument leans in the direction of democratic capitalism, but I would have very little gripe, if you will, if, let's say, I had a long lost relative in Sweden or the Netherlands or Germany or France, and they had come up through a different system and they said, well, I don't see it quite the way you do. I would be more interested in what we had in common than what we had in difference.
Sweden is an interesting case because you probably know this because you mentioned the Heritage ranking. Heritage actually ranks Sweden above the US
Yes.
in economic freedom, as opposed
Right.
to the Fraser ranking that you did.
Yeah.
Another thing that struck me is we talk about human, your comment there about if only we get the people on bottom on top. You know, there's this, you would think that people who've been oppressed when they become the new rulers would understand the harm of oppression. But the story of the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution is it's the opposite.
Yeah.
They're ready to get back. Another thing about human nature, you mentioned the belief, can we go on with this half and half? And I would say one thing that has really impressed me over my 30 years as an economist is the power of people to muddle through.
Mm.
And like Hayek, way back when he wrote The Road to Serfdom, this is an idea, of course, back in the 40s. We can't maintain this mixed system. It's got to go one or the other. It seems to me the lesson in most of history since then is, yes, we can, because that's what we've done.
Yeah.
And despite all the calls that this has to collapse at some point, you know, we start to sound like the Marxists, and there's going to be the inevitable communist. Well, how long do you have to wait before you start to think maybe that's not it? So I would argue a little bit, I guess, if I was going to disagree with anything, but at the end, when you said there was this, you know, we can't go on half and half, it's probably going to go one way or the other. That argument makes perfect sense to me. And I feel theoretically, I believe it. But as a practical matter, looking at the world in the last 30, 40 years, like, except we do seem to be able to continue on doing that year after year. As I say, the power of people to muddle through is really impressive.
I think you make a very good point there. And you're right, on a very practical level, people in these countries that we talk about, these focus countries, do seem to be muddling through fairly well a lot of crises. We've had financial crises, we've had global healthcare crises. One of the things that's true about these regulated market economies is they're resilient, and the people in them are resilient. And that, I think we should always remind ourselves of that. A good point.
All right, I will step back now and let other people have their comments.
All right. Well, I'll do my best to try to probe into some of what you presented today, Dr. Cooper.
Okay.
One of the things that surprised me in presenting the Freedom Index scores from the Fraser report and then your comments on the Fraser report afterward were specifically the fact that you mentioned that a lot of the top countries didn't really move from their initial rankings even after COVID. However, there seems to, based on what I remember reading in the news, there seems to be a pretty sharp exception to what I would consider to be politically free, and that would be the case of New Zealand. I remember reading in terms of the news that New Zealand was absolutely rabid about not opening its border, not allowing any kind of travel to or from the country, except if you were like triple vaxxed, etc. Was there any notice in its political ranking score as a result of that? Because I would expect that a really radical decision like that should affect its Freedom Index score.
I would think so too. And in fact, and I don't have the sheet in front of me, but when I looked at all 10 of those top 10, none of them moved more than 1 or 2 points, 1 or 2 positions. So maybe some of what we're looking at would be global effects in the regulated market economies that we're looking at that were similar to New Zealand, but of a less extreme nature. The other thing that might happen is we might see this showing up in a longer time frame, because we're only looking at a 3-year difference here between the data that I collected a few years ago and the data that's the most recent data that's available. But I would invite our listeners, anybody in the group, jump into these rankings, both Freedom House and the Fraser Institute. Look at the Heritage Foundation, Wall Street Journal, and look at others. There's a lot of them out there. I think there's a lot of useful data to be gleaned in those, and a lot of articles that you can follow up on that were written as a result of the data that came out in the rankings. It's a good, rich field to mine, and you'll gain insights all the time from that.
Okay, and then the second exception I would start to wonder about in those particular rankings is the case of China. China scored incredibly low on the Economic Freedom Report, and yet we always hear about the continued economic growth of the country as a whole. How do we square that circle?
I think that's one of the most interesting questions, Dr. Platt, that you can raise to this data. I suspect that the full story of China's economic miracle, if you will, over the last 20 years is yet to be written. I think there are some demographic time bombs in China today, which are likely to result in some significant change in standards of living. I think that the Chinese Communist Party realizes that it has built the economy on a tremendous amount of debt. And I think that they are very fearful of their citizens because, again, with any autocracy, if you're the monarch, you have total responsibility for everything that happens. And stuff happens. And just like our conversation with Dr. Harvath made the point, there's muddling through that has to happen. When you're in a country like China and things start to go south, you're at a very tenuous point in maintaining your power if you're a one-party state. So I would point you in some of the directions, some of the things, for example, that I've been reading most recently in the National Review about the Chinese economy and just how successful or unsuccessful it has been and what it's likely to be in the coming decades. It's an open question. But for now, you're exactly right. It looks like at least some argument can be made for a degree of economic success that happens within a one-party state system like China.
Can I add something here, which is
Yeah,
we want to
please
be clear about the distinction between a high level and growth. In that China,
Yeah.
China may go from being what did you say, there's 150 countries, 200 countries. Like, if China goes from a 180 worth country as far as economic freedom goes to maybe like the 100th, which is still really bad, that's such an improvement. We would expect major growth. Whereas Singapore just keeps China, they're going to have smaller growth, but they're going to be much richer because they've been growing for hundreds of years or however long they've been at the top of the list.
Yeah.
But I think what a lot of what we're seeing is they're much better than they were, which causes growth, but they are still very poor compared to very many other countries. And I agree, we're seeing signs now that their growth has come to a stop, and the road forward is tenuous, unless I mean, the way Dr. Cooper and I would say would be, unless they go ahead and add a lot more freedom, and then they can do the same jump up from being the 100th. Somebody once described the Soviet government, the Russian Revolution, as the Russians decided to try every bad idea anybody's ever had about government at once, and that really fits Mao's China very well. So once you stop doing every stupid thing that you could ever think of, things are going to get better, and they're probably going to get much better, but they're still going to be a lot worse than most other countries.
Yeah. Good point.
All right. I'll permit myself one more question before trying to get to some of the questions that were asked in the Q&A. And that question is going to be that there are other empirical approaches to measuring the success of a country to promote human flourishing. One of the most notable is perhaps what everyone has heard of, called the happiness index.
Yeah.
And that addresses questions that are not so utilitarian in nature, but speak more to the nature of the human as they live. And typically speaking, whenever you see these happiness indices reported, it is typically countries that adopt a more democratic socialist structure in terms of economy and government that rank highest on that list.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting point. Back in the day, when, say, Milton Friedman, Frederick Hayek, Michael Novak were writing, there was a lot of discussion about the idea of 2 cheers for capitalism. In other words, not 3 cheers for capitalism, but 2 cheers. Capitalism can do some really important things. It can bring a lot of prosperity. It can bring a lot of happiness, but maybe it doesn't necessarily provide the kind of spiritual or cultural happiness that can be achieved maybe only in other ways. And so I think part of this notion is that we could somehow use government or market regulation to ensure a kind of spiritual or aesthetic happiness by changing the rules, changing this subsidy there and this taxation policy there, etc. Take, for example, why does LeBron James make an astronomical salary and my grandchild's kindergarten teacher, who I think is the best kindergarten teacher I've ever seen, and I've been in that business for a long time, she makes a tiny fraction of that? Well, it's not because her name is Mrs. T to the kids. It's not because Mrs. T's work is of less value in a global sense of the term value, or in a spiritual sense, or an aesthetic sense of the word value. Her salary is determined as an economic value, which is determined by scarcity. So LeBron James can do something that nobody else can do, and do it on a global stage. Mrs. T may be able to do something more than what anybody else can do, but she can only do it with a class of 10 or 12 kindergartners, and she can do it in a great way, and she can earn my respect and the fact that I value what she does so much more than my favorite sports star, doesn't have to be whoever it is. Value in an economic sense is different than value in a spiritual sense. Hence, we shouldn't expect capitalism to do for us all of those things that we hope to have done for us in our life. Again, I go back to Novak's handy model of a political and economic and a cultural realm of society. And the fact that in these constitutional republics that have developed, there are wide swaths of human activity that are beyond the control of government. And I think for a very, very good reason. Economic activity is one of those. A lot of economic activity is and should be beyond the control of government, but then a lot of other things should be too. I don't want people telling me what religion to believe in. I don't want people telling me whether I should appreciate Wagner's music more than bluegrass. There are lots of values to be had, and there's a lot to be said for having the individual freedom to pursue happiness, as the founding fathers wrote. Have government ensure your life, your liberty, and your pursuit of happiness, whatever that happiness definition might be for you. So,
within the limits of what is lawful, of course.
exactly.
And that's where things start to get messy.
Yeah, always.
All right.
I hope that answers your question. It's a good question.
Yeah, and it does verge on some of the question about, okay, how much can we talk about between what is material and what is not material and not as empirical? And that's, I think, one of the challenges of this whole area of debate, because so much of it might be supported with data, but there's a lot that I think rests on what is ideology, since I think we could all agree that what a country believes it's about itself in terms of its culture is ultimately more important than its economics or even its politics.
Yeah.
And that's where things get messy. I may have a couple more things I might be able to bring up and share, but I want to make sure I get some of the questions that are here in the Q&A. First thing that comes up here in the Q&A, when I hear Democratic Socialist, I think of Californian Governor Gavin Newsom and how he runs California. Not a fan. He is a fan to enough in the state, so he is our governor by law. And I'm just thankful that it's him as the governor and not necessarily the legislature. So, because there are some things that our legislature passed, I just double take and I'm like, what? And he's actually made some important vetoes in spite of his party. Second question here. Are you familiar with the Sinafin model for complexity? So much of your diagram aligns with those concepts. If you saw me looking off screen for a little bit, that was because I was trying to pull up an example of what that looks like. So I'll go ahead and try to share my screen and see if I can pull up that image of what our questioner is referring to. So it would be this particular image right here, where you have it sort of bifurcated into 4 pieces. And that at the middle of everything, there is confusion, which is kind of important.
Good. Yeah, I'm going to have to spend some time with that. I can see some similarities, but also a lot of differences in what's happening here with the description, the schematic description.
Yeah, it seems like a very interesting way to organize the different parts of something that goes into an argument, or multiple arguments that are multiple viewpoints that are coming together.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
thank you, listener, whoever presented that. I'll capture this screen and we'll include it with the slides as just a food for thought, if you will. We'll make an appendix called food for thought.
All right, I'll try to make sure I have those divisions in the video. All right, thank you very much for that. All right, another question that we have here. I'll stop the share. As far as the question opens that they highly agree with Mr. Harvath regarding how the oppressed could become the oppressors. And they have a specific question with regard to that regarding equity here in America. And the specific question reads, AKA DEI has run amok. Can Doctors Plett, Cooper, and Harvath give thoughts on equity versus meritocracy? Equity sounds socialist in its construction, whereas a merit-based system seems on the more conservative side. So if any one of us want to take a crack at that first, feel free to go ahead.
I'll jump in on that. When I think of equity, and I've spent a lot of years teaching ethics, one of the examples that as an ethics teacher I use of the difference between equity and equality is how parents might treat their children, knowing what the differences are between those children, their personalities, how, for example, they respond to discipline. And so I would argue that a good parent isn't necessarily pursuing the equal treatment of his or her children, so much as they are pursuing their best guess about what the equitable solution to the problem might be. When we take that example into, say, the workplace or into the political order, we will immediately run up against the problem of paternalism. If the boss or the president of the country or the collective will of the legislature decides that rather than treat all of its citizens equally, they should be treated equitably. And only in the last couple of years have I seen our politicians really sort of address this question quite directly and say, we want equity, we don't want equality. Then I would say we're on dangerous ground. Ground that would not be dangerous in the context of a family can be very dangerous in the context of a nation. And as I read the Founding Fathers, I was surprised to realize how much emphasis they put on this question of the equality of outcome rather than the equality of opportunity. And in some of the writings in the Federalist Papers, and you see it dimly reflected in the Constitution as well, I think the Founding Fathers were making the point that when you have a foot race, if everybody starts at the same starting line, there will be differences about how people finish. And some people will be in first and second and third place, etc. Those differences will be accounted for by luck, by perseverance, by a variety of factors. But if they had equality of opportunity, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then we should be willing to accept the outcome of the race. The problem, however, and this is clearly in that literature, I wish I could cite you chapter and verse, but in that thinking of the Founding Fathers and in some of the French philosophy that went before it, if you wanted to impose equality of outcome, you would have to impose inequality of opportunity. You'd have to change the starting line, and you continuously have to change the starting line. And so in other words, you have to make a choice between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. So again, I go back to my illustration. As a parent, and I'm a parent of 3 kids, I want them all to flourish. And I might come up with some equitable forms of reward and punishment, if you will. But I also spent nearly 30 years as a CEO, and it's the very last thing I would consider to be right, ethical, or smart as a CEO to take someone's equal opportunity to succeed in the workplace, in their profession, and change the rules as we go so that their outcomes would be equal and their opportunity would be unequal. Does that make sense?
Thank you for your input, Dr. Cooper. I'd also add that another way you can frame this is in the terms of justice. What is a just outcome given what goes into the life of a human being? And those on the side of equity would say, because of these unequal starts, because of the nature of someone's birth, it seems unjust that they don't have the same economic opportunities as a result, given where they're starting from. And so it seems just then, as a society, to provide means for those who did not start with those sort of economic advantages to get up to what they would consider to be a fair starting line. And so the ethics of that are very difficult to parse, especially since there's a huge part of our natural human compassion that speaks to that particular plight, especially if the person in question is one who is earnest and honestly trying to do their best with what they've got.
Right. And by the way, I think there was after this latest release of the Economic Freedom Index from the Fraser Institute, there was a very good article that tried to rank countries, if you will, according to how much opportunity there was for economic climbing the ladder, if you will, economic growth and success. And I don't know that this is the case, but I suspect that there's also a very high correlation between the countries that are our focus countries being able to have greater opportunities for dramatic shifts in the status in life and the economic success of their citizens versus some of the countries that are lower on that scale. But this is another thing I'll try to put in the appendix as food for thought, because I think I saw this article some time ago, but I think it was actually generated by the Economic Freedom Index. And Dr. Horvath, you might know the answer to this. There's a standard economics measure of mobility, class mobility or income mobility. Does that ring any bells? Unmute yourself.
Oh, you're muted.
Yeah.
I must have missed that day in class because I don't know what the standard measure would be. I mean, I've seen a couple different ones in papers. Yeah.
So one of the things our listeners might be interested to know, standard measures of income distribution or income inequality are things like the Gini coefficient, Gini, which compare create, for example, a ratio of the top 20% of income earners with the bottom 20% of income earners. And typically the Gini coefficient for any of those countries that you see on the scale is going to be on the slide, is going to be anywhere from say 5-to-1 to 10-to-1. And rarely does the Gini coefficient get outside of that particular range. And interestingly enough, the Gini coefficient measures for these countries do not correlate much at all with how socialist or how capitalist they are. There seems to be something else that's interesting that's going on in those cultures or in those countries or with their policies. Cuba, for example, has always had about a 8-to-1 or a 10-to-1 Gini coefficient. And for the last several decades, a country like Taiwan is probably more like 5-to-1 or 6-to-1. So I just throw that out for further thought. Income inequality or income distribution is another interesting factor to examine and to rank countries by. And then a third one might be, or a fourth one, I guess we would say, might be this mobility factor, which I'm going to do some research and figure out where that article was that I read about it. But one in which we try to get an empirical understanding of how much class mobility there might be in a particular system versus another. I'll find it.
All right. Thank you very much for that question. That was a very rich discussion. I do have another good one here, and this one gets pretty into the data here. Thank you for the person who wrote this. On the side presentation, when we were talking about the focus countries that involved democratic capitalism versus democratic socialism, where was the distinction when it came to the social welfare programs within those countries? At what point do you say, okay, this country is democratic socialist, this country is democratic capitalist, and what sort of implications did it have in terms of the economic outcomes? And I think related to that would be one of the questions I was thinking of was, we have the rankings, but what is the actual separation in terms of outcomes between democratic capitalist versus democratic socialist?
Yeah. Well, those are great questions. And actually, you can read the full report and you can get a lot of the answers to those questions. My reading of it is generally that there's not often a tremendous amount of difference between those democratic socialist countries and those democratic capitalist countries. And again, as I said, these overall rankings are the result of scores that happen at the sub-score level. They are the sums of the sub-scores. And country by country, there are a lot of differences. I believe I recall in the Fraser report, to directly answer this question, the score concerning the size of the welfare state had to do with the governmental expenditures on the total welfare state system as a percentage of GDP. So probably a rather blunt kind of instrument, if you will, to make a comparison, but one at least where you could start and you could say, okay, how much of a country's gross domestic product is used in this way? Or another way of saying it is, how much redistribution of income is there in order to accomplish these social goods, which have been, again, democratically approved by legislatures and voters in those quote unquote democratic socialist countries. I do want to commend to you reading that report, though, in its details, because one of the things the economists, people like Jim Gwartney and Michael, the guy at the Fraser Institute, I forgot his last name right now, some wonderful economists have put a lot of very careful work into developing a grid of measurables which can be both significant in its own right at the granular level and significant at the macro level in, for example, developing an overall ranking, an overall score on a country by country basis. They all get there by a different journey. There's everything, all of the granular data pushes in various opposite directions before we get down to an actual ranking. And it's very interesting to see that how that all develops.
All right, thank you for the question, and thank you for the recommendation. For the attendees, I have posted a link to that Fraser Institute Economic Freedom report in the webinar chat. So that link should take you to this year's version of the report, actually. 2024 came out in mid-September, so you do have access to the freshest numbers of what we got. So thank you again for that question. And I think given the time and being aware of the fact that Dr. Cooper is 2 hours ahead of us in Texas, I think we have one last good question here, so I'll wrap it up on this one. What resources would you point to on how to teach these topics to a younger audience, or what other resources would you recommend for younger learners?
Yeah, boy, that's a tough question. I haven't had the assigned task to teach this, for example, to say middle school kids. I've taught it to college prep juniors and seniors in high school, and to lots of college students and graduate students. But I do think I'm a big believer in primary sources. I think going back to something like Milton Friedman's, what's it called? Freedom, his standard text, the classic work he and his wife wrote.
Is that
Anyway,
free to choose?
Free to choose. Thank you. Thank you. Or going back to something like Mike Novak's argument, the spirit of democratic capitalism. I happened to be in the wings and at the time frame when both of those came out. And one of the things that was said about Milton Friedman's book, Free to Choose, is that it was a rigorous social scientific empirical analysis of those things that make capitalism superior to socialism. When people saw Michael Novak's book, The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, they said, this is the companion volume, if you will, that lays out the philosophical case for the superiority of capitalism over socialism. And so people would often say, reading those two books together, whether you're of an empirical bent or a philosophical bent, they're both very great places to start. And I would say at this stage of the game, almost sort of primary documents. And then a lot of other subsequent conversations can be had about specifics with regard to how those countries or how those systems have developed over the last 20 or 30 years. I find one of my most useful resources is the National Review. I think it's one of the best magazines going, and it has a tremendous amount of economic theory. You can read a lot about politics and a lot about partisanship, but if you focus on the economics section, you will learn a lot. And that would be one of the resources that I would suggest for people. But again, we're talking about being able to develop an understanding of this as a teacher. And I'm not so sure I could readily say that I have something readily at hand to recommend that you could use with, say, high school kids or middle school kids. I'm sure there's good stuff out there. I'm not familiar with it.
All right. Thank you for your recommendations, Dr. Cooper.
You're welcome.
All right, before we wrap this up, Dr. Harvath, do you have any other last comments or questions for Dr. Cooper?
No, just to thank him for his time, and it was quite interesting. And I'm a slightly more informed person now than I was before. So that makes it 2 hours worth. It's a good use of my scarce time this last 2 hours.
Well, thank you for all of your emendations and participation in this. You made it much richer as a result. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Harvath. Thank you, Dr. Cooper. This is Timothy Plett, and for the Renegade Institute for Liberty, and that is a wrap. So thank you all for coming out. And for those of you who participated, I will try to grab all your emails from the registration. And when I have this posted on YouTube, I will let you all know. And if you would be able to go back and review the recording at your leisure. Thank you all for attending.